And even if you imagine it as a series of concentric circles, it always focuses on things near at hand. Therefore, the importance of family relationships, the importance of interpersonal communication, of self-realization, of issues that could be considered experientially very much directed to our concrete existence. And yet, in the last couple of sessions, we try to explore, on the surface, radically different notion about humanity as all-embracive sensitivity. This is another attempt, and this will bring us to the end of a major discussion on the Confucian discourse. And starting from next week, we want to look at it much more critically from the modernistic perspectives, from modern enlightenment, from human rights, from feminist point of view, from ecology. And I hope we'll be able to show that the Confucian tradition, Confucian humanism, if you're seasoned in the language that it's been developed here, will have some resources to respond to the criticisms and maybe formulate some broader visions. And here we can say the Confucian tradition is very rich in terms of its resources for us to understand not only ourselves and in communication, but the human condition as it is understood today. And when we use the term human condition, it's very generally stated. It's not related to any particular culture, any particular ethnicity, any particular nation, or any particular stage of development. It's just a general statement, a general situation of the human condition. It's assumed that if we want to understand the meaning of life, some skeptical scholars say you can never understand the meaning of life unless you're able to get out of it. And there's no way we can get out of the situation of living in order to reflect upon it. Some other scholars also say you can never really understand the environment in which you live unless you're able to get out of it. And in a curious way, in our century, in our generation, the human ingenuity for the first time enabled us to go out of the earth and reflect upon it. And for the first time, we know the blue planet from a totally different perspective, and we have some sense of its limitless, its beauty, and of course the kind of resources we can even graphic, the kind of resources that we have, and the danger of depletion of some of these resources. From this perspective, the talk I'm going to present, the whole issue of the body and the universe is no longer the figment of the mind. It becomes particularly persuasive. That's one of the reasons why some of these issues are now being very widely explored. In fact, a particular volume on Confucianism and ecology just came out and attracted a great deal of attention. In the classical period, we know that in the Analects, when one of Confucius' disciples complained that all other people have brothers and sisters and he was all alone, the disciple responded, his disciples responded that according to our teacher, within the four seas, all men are brothers. In other words, all human beings are brothers and sisters. That notion of universal care was very deeply rooted in the Analects. So the Analects is not simply about family ethics. It's about ethics generally stated. That's true in Mencius when he talked about all things are there already in me. If I reflect upon myself and find that I'm truthful, this is the greatest joy. And Mencius, even further, we will refer to Mencius' notion about the vital energy that you can cultivate, which eventually will be able to feel between heaven and space, heaven and earth, feel the whole space. And we know that the great learning began with the self, but gradually extended to a universal peace. The doctrine of the mean, profoundly religious in the sense that if we can really realize ourselves, eventually we can take part in the transforming and nourishing process than heaven and earth. Even a very skeptical thinker like Xunzi also recognized that human beings are interconnected because of the importance of energy that forms everything, with fire, with water, with birds and beasts, and with all modalities of being. So even though he wanted to talk about the uniqueness of being human, he's quite aware that human beings possess not only sense of duty or rightness, but also consciousness, life, and energy. Since everything, every modality of being is made of energy, in that sense, human beings are interconnected with a much larger world. So the classical legacy clearly provides a very comprehensive vision of the human in the universe. But it is in the Neo-Confucian tradition that this vision became fully developed. The first person in the Neo-Confucian tradition that developed it is Zhou Dunyi. The name is on the list. And his diagram of the great ultimate, or explanation of the diagram of the great ultimate, becomes the basis of Neo-Confucian thinking about embodying the universe. Originally, I was debating whether I should show you the diagram, but I decided against it because it may become a focus of attention that is not our primary purpose. The statement itself may be a little bit difficult to follow, but if with my explanation, it shouldn't be too difficult to grasp the general thrust of that statement. In the diagram, it begins with the notion that the ultimate reality, the great ultimate, in fact, is not the creator, but the source of generating the energies of yin and yang. This is the male and female energy, and the 5 agents, referring to the water, fire, metal, wood, and earth. So these 5 elements, they are all constitutions of vital energy, together with the yin-yang primordial forces and the great ultimate, in fact, could be considered as the sources of the development of our universe. The interaction of these 2 vital energies, the yin and yang energies, engenders and transforms the myriad things, together with the elements that we mentioned. The myriad things produce and reproduce, resulting in an unending transformation. So the notion is the unfolding of the universe, very much in keeping with the evolutionary perspective of the various kinds of forces interacting among themselves. The cosmos, made of qi, we don't have to repeat that term, is the great transformation, since it encompasses all modalities of being in the process. Everything is imbued with qi as a vital and dynamic component of the cosmic process. So air, water, stone, plant, animal, and human. Human beings ought to be aware that they are an integral part of this great transformation. But at the same time, human beings, as I noted earlier, is different. Human beings should be considered as the most sentient and sensitive beings in the cosmos. The emphasis is not on human rationality, even though it's important, on human ability to use tools, or the human ability to understand, therefore to control nature, or the human ability to use various kinds of biologically determined functions, such as linguistic ability, but sensitivity. And human beings are defined as sentient beings. And you can even derive from this notion that human beings ought to believe that they are filial children of the cosmos. This is exactly what Zhang Zai, one of the leading Neo-Confucian thinkers in the Western inscription, begins his articulation of his vision. A very short statement, it's already on the handout. Heaven is my father, and earth is my mother, and even such a small creature as I finds an intimate place in their midst. Therefore, that which fills the universe I regard as my body, that which directs the universe, I consider my nature. All people are my brothers and sisters, and all things are my companions. And then he has specific statements about a human being ought to conduct his or her life. And this vision of the human as the filial children of the cosmos is dramatically different from the modern existential notion of the human as being thrown into this world without knowing why, and our meaning of life has to be struggled through our conscious reshaping of the universe. We do not know why we're here, but through struggle, through our conscious effort to conquer, to make decisions, to shape ourselves, gradually we'll be able to find some meaning in life. This notion, it's not a romantic assertion about uniting everything. It's a notion that we are here because there is some specific purpose. It's not teleology, very limited, understood in a very limited sense. There's a purpose. And that purpose is linked to our ability to communicate to every sphere in the universe. The question then later is asked, is there anything in the universe that human beings can think of that is truly irrelevant? Can we think about anything, something, say, wow, virus? Well, it's not irrelevant. Third, any structure, distant star, anything in the universe that is not considered totally irrelevant. The uniqueness of being human lies in the stuff, the biological chemical stuff that the human body and human mind is made of. It's the highest excellence of the vital energy. But that stuff that makes us human, one particular feature of that is our sensitivity. But sensitivity in this sense is linked to our ability to reflect, to think, to observe, to understand. But this reflection, thinking power is not something that we alone possess in order to control, to manipulate. The idea is that we're interconnected as integral part of the universe, therefore we should assume the responsibility of stewardship. And if our sensitivity as being linked to an ever-extending network of relationship is undermined, it's not simply a problem of our health or mental state, but it is profoundly meaningful ethical question. So Chen Hao, another major thinker, made a very simple observation, but in order to truly understand the underlying meaning of that observation, we need a little bit of explanation. The observation is simply this. A book on medicine describes paralysis of the four limbs as absence of Ren. Ren is the term that we use to translate humanity. Humanity also means sensitivity, the lack of humanity. This is an excellent description. A person of humanity regards heaven, earth, and all things as one body. To him, there's nothing that is not himself. Since he has recognized all things as himself, can there be any limit to his humanity? If things are not parts of the self, naturally they have nothing to do with it. As in the paralysis of the four limbs, the vital energy no longer penetrates them, and therefore they are no longer parts of the self. In other words, the paralysis of the four limbs is talking about our body. If one part of the body is paralyzed, then I don't feel pain or itch or any sensation. And that part of me is no longer my body. Now, Chen Hao believes this is an excellent way of understanding the human person, humanity, in the most comprehensive vision of humanity as being linked to the cosmos. If there's one part of the world or the cosmos that is no longer relevant, which means that part to us is like paralyzed limb. We cannot feel, we cannot have any sense, any direction, and we've been cut off. If we have been cut off, then our humanity becomes diminished. So we should have a much broader vision of humanity. This is not to expand everything. This is the notion about interconnectedness through human sensitivity. Now, this could be considered as a continuation of the idea of being human in the classical Confucian tradition. This is not simply a total departure. It is to underscore something very fully developed already in the classical Confucian tradition. Simply to summarize what actually happened in terms of the ethical implications. And this view argues very forcefully that either egoism or collectivism will not work. You simply cannot imagine yourself simply as a privatized, partial, fragmented, with a certain kind of inner directedness and obsessed with your isolated individual. The whole notion about individuality, understood as an island, we call it individualism, is based upon the dignity of the person, independent of social connections, independent of all kinds of other environmental influences, because the dignity of the person is linked to a transcendent. Now, the Confucians don't have this particular resource to think about the individual linked to a transcendent has all the dignity that is required. On the other hand, even individualism in the West, only in the 17th, 18th century, 18th, 19th century, became a positive idea. During the period of the French Revolution, individualism was always considered as negative. This egoism, in the modern context, is based upon a fascinating psychological interpretation of the ego, of the id, and the superego. Not just in the Freudian tradition, I think it's part of the general language here. The notion is that the development, even there, the development of the ego, true ego, it's difficult. The id, the various kinds of instinctual demands, especially sex drives, sexual drives and so forth, are powerful, conditioning us. The superego, internalized message or conscience of society also present a major oppressive power. So the development of the ego, sometimes the idea is like a man riding on a horse. The energy comes from the horse. And the man will have some kind of direction, but the man has no control of the energy. And the direction may be given by someone else, like society. So it's difficult, very difficult for the ego to truly develop itself. But from the Confucian point of view then, the self, when it's degenerated into a privatized ego, it becomes, later we discuss it, becomes a form of evil, because the interconnectedness is being cut off. However, if a person is simply immersed in the group as an integral part of a large entity, without a sense of self-direction, without any personal participation in that process, then a person is not able to truly realize the full potential. Because collectivism fails to understand differentiation, principle of differentiation, fails to understand the subtlety and the nuanced understanding of relationship. Any form of relationship is a qualitatively different form, and we really have to negotiate that relationship through self-understanding as essential relationships. So the quality of life is depend upon a very, you can say, grandiose grandiose vision of the interconnectedness between the person and the cosmos. But at the same time, the negotiation of the person's development is to find a path which is neither egoistic nor collectivistic, but I would call it a form of personalism. The person as essential relationships. A personalism is to try to develop the person as a flowing stream rather than an isolated individual. There's of course always tension in the Confucian tradition about how to do that. Whether you focus your attention on the self-knowledge while you're engaged in social activities, or you accept the rules of the game already stated in the society in order to refine your behavior, try to overcome the selfish desires that are antisocial or contrary to the social norm. You have the Mencius notion that you really have to focus about inner self as the basis. You have the Xunzian notion, which argues that focusing on the self is not good enough. You really have to observe the ritual, the ideas, and the various kinds of social conventions, like learning the language. You have to learn the grammar of the language. You cannot create your own grammar. You can be very creative after you've mastered the language. Now, Mencius would say, look, is learning a language a creative act or simply imitation? It is a creative act. It's generative. It is try to relate yourself to the outside world, so the linguistic ability you do is inner. It's not totally posed from the outside. We know that in linguistics this has been debated and argued at the same time. Whether all the environmental, everybody recognizes the power of environmental conditions. And yet some would consider environmental conditions as so determinative that the inner resources are not able to be totally mobilized to fight against it. In the time of affluence, people become lazy. In the time of hardship, people become reckless. So we're conditioned in the state of Chu. You always learn the language of Chu. In the state of Qi, you learn the language of Qi. You're not able to overcome all these constraints. And yet, I think the mainstream of thinking, especially now in the Neo-Confucian period, Mencius loomed large in everybody's mind, and Xunzi was relegated to the background. Only in the recent century, in the 20th century, Xunzi was rediscovered. So for the last 800 years, most of the East Asian intellectuals accepted the Mencius idea. Here, in North America, Xunzi seems to be more persuasive. It's a very interesting phenomenon. Why Mencius? By focusing on the inner, on self-knowledge, on the person. Of course, without rejecting or ignoring the importance of the outside world, it turned out to be a much more persuasive intellectual. I think part of the reason is this notion about the human as interconnected with the cosmic order. It's the worldview that informs the ethics. It is not the ethics that determines what our worldview ought to be. If you don't have the correct worldview, you don't have a sense of how human is related not only to other human beings, but to nature and to heaven, to animals, to plants, to trees. If you don't have a broader vision about the human, you will never be able to fully fix the human ethics that is the most appropriate. So in this sense, I hope you will be able to at least remember one thing about the Confucian humanistic orientation. It is not anthropological alone. Certainly not anthropocentric, not focused simply on the person. It is not even simply anthropological. It is not simply focusing on the human community. It is a form of humanism that professes the unity of humanity and heaven. It not only doesn't slight the importance of the superior power outside, so in this sense I think the Confucian tradition can be made, it itself, not that, can be made to be very responsive to many of the issues raised in Christianity, in Buddhism, and in Judaism and Islam. Some scholars in sinological studies do not accept my optimism, but I do believe that in the Confucian tradition there is a very profound ethical religious dimension that makes the tradition responsive to the other views. But of course, it has its own trajectory, has its own concern. The important thing is not only to overcome the dichotomy of egoism and collectivism and focusing on the inner resources, without relegating the environment and others to the background, but actively involved in the nourishing of the vital energy that we all are endowed with. Now, if we follow the Mencius line of thinking, the kind of energy that each one of us is endowed with is the finest vital energy of the cosmos. So when Mencius was once asked, so what are you good at? And he said he was good at cultivating the flood-like qi. And this is difficult to translate. Flood-like, like a terrain. Flood-like qi. In Chinese, 浩然之气, which could mean very powerful, moving force. 浩然之气. So the person asked, What do you mean by that? One translator said, the strong moving power. So how can you cultivate that as measures? Well, it's difficult to explain. This is the first state. It is the kind of qi, the kind of energy, which is in the highest degree vast and unyielding. Nourish it with integrity and place no obstacle in its path, and it will fill the space between heaven and earth. This is what Mencius talked about. It's not in the Neo-Confucian tradition, it's classical. It is the qi, it is the vital energy that unites rightness, which is the human idea of the proper way of being human, rightness, with the way. Deprive of this and it will collapse. It is born of cumulative rightness. We do our ordinary things properly. We have to accumulate that. It cannot be appropriated by anyone through a sporadic show of rightness. We have to have a proper way of cultivating, of nourishing, of doing, be a good person, be a true person, be a beautiful person, be a great person, be a sagely person, be a spiritual person. You know, this whole different degree. But this is a process. And this process is, in fact, from the Mencian point of view, not only ethically significant, it's even cosmologically significant. What you're doing here is not simply to perfect your character, to become a good person, appreciated by society. From Mencian point of view, it's not mysticism at all. Heaven will appreciate that as well. And this is the way that we'll be able to link to a much larger universe, not just the human universe. And this, of course, is very deeply rooted in Chinese medicine. So you can say it's not simply ethical, but it's also considered natural, and it's a natural way to help us to develop our health. A healthy person in this sense is not simply physically strong. A healthy person is ethically significant as well. I'm not saying only healthy person are ethical, right? Don't get it confused. But the argument is very interesting. By conceptualizing the body, as I noted earlier, as energy fields, health is measured by the overall pattern of their interaction, the interaction of the various energy fields in our body. Each energy field is defined not by its physical properties, but by its specific role in the processing, storage, and distribution of vital energy, and thus in the maintenance of life. The health of a person is measured by your vitality, your health. Since the poor condition and functioning of one particular field affects the performance of all others, corrective measures will have to be applied simultaneously to several seemingly unconnected arenas. Treating a headache by solely focusing on the head, or foot pain by dealing exclusively with the foot, is often ridiculed in the Chinese medicine as a superficial, partial, and temporary relief for conditions which may have deep roots elsewhere. So the absence of observable symptoms of ailment, disease, discomfort, or pain does not necessarily mean health. If the primary purpose of medicine is healing rather than curing, healthcare for the maintenance of life must promote the enhancement of vitality, not only as a preventive measure, but for its own sake. So medical intervention is directed at the intersection of the energy fields in order to restore the organic pattern of their natural flow. Isolated treatment without a holistic grasp of the well-being of the total person is at best one-sided. The ethical implication is very obvious. We may get our life situation correctly, but we don't have an overall vision of who we are. There's no general pattern of our life situation. We are going to deal with specific situations when these situations arise, but we don't have any broader vision of what we ought to be. Since the vitality of the body depends on the smooth functioning of numerous interconnected energy fields, medical wisdom entails personal knowledge of how energy, which is distributed throughout the body, from the innermost organs to the surface of the skin, actually works. So ethically speaking, it is not just our behavior, how we act and judged by others are doing fine. We never get into a disciplinary committee. So everything is fine. But it's not just the behavior, but also the attitude. Not only the attitude, but also the deep beliefs and deep sense of our own personal worth. These are interconnected. Because the ethical life is not simply judged in terms of behavior. The healing, in this sense, is not simply to cure diseases or to correct mistakes. The healing itself is to increase the vital energy, to have a sense of purpose, to generate internal resources. And the more internal resources we have, the better person we become. I mean, of course, in physical sense, but also in mental sense. Now, following this particular line of thinking, a great thinker of the 15th, 16th century, in his inquiry on the great learning, made again an observation, which is quite specific. I hope you'll get a chance to reread it, about how human beings are interconnected with the universe and how interconnectedness can be defined in terms of human sensitivity. Let me quote, it's a bit long, but I think I should go through this because it has generated a lot of discussions. He's talking about a great person, a great man like Chen Hao, forms one body with heaven and earth and myriad things. And he said the reason that a great person can do that is not because it deliberately wants to do it. It's not a desire or certain kind of thinking process that enables the person to do so. It is just in the nature of being human that is able to do so. So any human being, belittled people or ordinary people, can do that as well. So this demonstration then is not a demonstration of the mind cultivated through vigorous training, so a person has become a great person or a person has become a sage. This is a demonstration, Weiming's demonstration, that every one of us is capable of doing. In fact, every one of us does it in a particular situation. Again, using the mentioned idea, therefore, when he sees a child about to fall into the well, he cannot help a feeling of alarm and commiseration. This shows that his humanity forms one body with the child. It may be objected that the child belongs to the same species. Again, when he observes the pitiful cries and frightened appearance of birds and animals about to be slaughtered, he cannot help feeling an inability to bear their suffering. This shows that his humanity forms one body with birds and animals. It may be objected that birds and animals are sentient beings as he is. When he sees plants broken and destroyed, he cannot help a feeling of pity. This shows that his humanity forms one body with plants. It may be said that plants are living things as he is. Yet, even when he sees tires and stones shattered and crushed, he cannot help a feeling of regret. This shows that his humanity forms one body with tires and stones. This means that even the mind of the small man or ordinary person necessarily has the humanity, which now I translate as sensitivity, that forms one body with all. Now, this notion about forming one body is highly differentiated. A sense of alarm and sense of commiseration, a sense of inability to bear the suffering, a sense of pity, a sense of regret. They are very different senses. But each one of them is personally felt. Each one of them, we can say there's a personal experience of pain or suffering when that happens. In different degrees, but the possibility of being able to relate to that. That's the reason, from Weiming's point of view, that we are linked, or we are able to embody heaven and earth and the myriad things. But that embodiment, of course, in this particular sense, is highly differentiated. You can actually take all these arguments away and back to simply the human community. And the argument would be something like this. you feel really a sense of alarm and commiseration if some of the people who are really close to you, family members, suffer. You may not have the same kind of feeling with others, but that's natural. Now the big question is, should you be so confident and so self-indulgent that that kind of response is the only one that you need? Should we cultivate that response so we be able to feel also uncomfortable if people who are not related to us directly also suffer? So that's the question. If you tweak, if you develop it, if you extend it, then it becomes vital and it becomes embracive. If you don't, it will be just limited. So there are a number of theoretical issues that need to be considered. I just take 2 or 3. One is the assumption that the principle, we say the principle of this sensitivity, that human sensitivity, as a defining characteristic of being human, is a one principle. And the manifestation of that principle is quite various. There's so many different ways that particular principle will manifest itself. The principle of being human as a form of sensitivity is something that is not being rejected. It's in fact underscored because of common human experience. But that principle, in terms of its concrete manifestation, it should have many different forms. If you believe in a very sort of digital way of thinking, if you believe a linear progression, if you believe in something that will have to be manifested in one way, then you will not be able to get the complexity of the relationship between the one and the many. And I know, I don't know, you're aware of this fractal theory and so forth, but any very simple design, very, very simple design, a few lines and so forth, it becomes repeated in numerous ways, and it could become extremely complicated. And just imagine, in a biological sense, the split of the cell, 1 to 2, 2 to 3. It's just, how come the various kinds of organs emerged? Questions of emergence. How come they emerge? All these mysterious issues will have to be encountered by the idea of the oneness of principle and the multiplicity of its manifestations. And it's also in this particular thing that Weiming and many other Neo-Confucian thinkers really believe, as what Fingeret characterized the whole Confucian project, that the secular as sacred. Is in this sense you have to accept the view that the earth out there is not just the dirt, the object, the datum. There's the sanctity of the earth over there. There's certain kind of numinous power, the sacredness of the earth, and also the sacredness of the body. Don't undermine the body and privileging the importance of the mind, the heart, rationality, thinking. In a very interesting conference on artificial intelligence, people are just amazed by how artificial intelligence is going to help us. Not only now that it can defeat us in terms of all the chess masters, but it's going to, because it doesn't make any mistake, and also it has incredible memory, and continue. Then one of the leading scholars in artificial intelligence, Bert Dreyfus, asked the question, how about the body? In other words, unless the artificial intelligence eventually would deal with the problem of the body. That is because the human, no matter how artificially you can progress, as intelligence, has the body, and unless the body is figured in that process, you will never be able to overcome many of the issues that we considered here. Now the idea then, since heaven and earth and myriad things are all embodied in our sensitivity, how can we communicate? Not just within the human community, of course we learn it from nature as well, but how do we communicate beyond the human community? One statement, I think it's very critical, Thomas Berry, or write his name. He's a theologian, but now he decided not to call him a theologian, he called him a geologian by focusing on the importance of the earth. And he said, how can we transform our notion of nature from a collection of objects into a communion of subjects? It's a major challenge to us all. Now, a collection of objects is to say it isn't, because it's an object, it's always outside of us. We can dissect, we can understand, we can control, we can manipulate, but it's not part of us. If you follow Chen Hao's argument seriously, Chen Hao's argument saying humanity is such which forms one body with heaven and earth and myriad things. If you regard something as outside, as irrelevant, as something over there, then your sensitivity, in fact, deliberately cuts it off. It's like that, it's the paralyzed part of my sensitivity. I don't want to feel anything about it. Now, we can do that with animals now. We can do that with plants. But how do we do with mountains, with rivers? The notion is that for example, an artist, a great artist, wanted to depict mountains. And his teacher said, well, don't do it, because you have no knowledge about what mountain is. Go and live in the mountains for 3 months without looking at it, but feeling. Immerse yourself in the mountains. Then you come back and try to paint the mountain. Because you have to be able, this is the artistic notion, but I think ethically very significant. You shouldn't depict the mountains in terms of form likeness, like take a photograph. The only way as an artist you can depict the true nature of mountain is you've been there, and then when you come back, you try to move beyond form likeness, not just taking a picture, but to establish, this is the term used, a spiritual communion. Unless you have the kind of spiritual communion with nature, you'll never be able to depict it. Even in terms of photograph. If you look at some of the great photographs of the Yosemite by Mr. Adams, and the guy really lived in the mountains for a long, long period of time. Why we see those photographs from the Yosemites not simply as photographs of a mountain, but as spiritual representation of nature, is because there is, in my view, if you follow this line of thinking, certain kind of spiritual communion has been established. It's not mysticism. It's just a sense, it's an attitude, it's a way of life. So to move from the collection of objects to the communion of subjects is to allow all dimensions, all modalities of being to be an integral part of our self-realization. Now this does not mean that only the sages or the perfected human beings are able to do that. In fact, that's why I use the term authentic possibility rather than simply a potential. It is not the case that each one of us has the potential of realizing that, but normally we don't have time, don't have energy, don't have the strength to do it, and don't have maybe the cultural background and so forth. But from this argument, it is excuse, because this is what every human being is capable of doing. This is not simply restricted to those human beings before the industrial society didn't have much more to do and didn't have a very superior rationality, so they became more aesthetically in tune. But this is not the argument. The argument is really have to. I don't have time to elaborate on the negative side, but that's not my intention. I simply want to note briefly why there's evil. If the world is depicted in terms of the community of all. Now, Weiming's statement is very straightforward. Again, if you follow the many of the reasonings going on, you should get it very clearly. The fear, the anxiety, was the loss of the original heart of sensitivity. The real danger in the human community. Mencius even said, the great person will should always be able to preserve the childlike mind or the heart of a newborn baby. Of course, the Taoists and others talked about it, because that heart is the most sensitive, most responsive, most open to all kinds of possibilities. Only when our hearts and minds are not, this is what Weiming says, aroused by desires and obscured by selfishness can we form one body with heaven and earth and myriad things. I say even if we are obscure by selfishness and aroused by desires, that possibility is still always there. A good afternoon in the woods and good conversation with a friend, we do have that. It's always being experienced. It's not totally lost. Okay. But when the mind is aroused by desires and obscure by selfishness, this is quoting Weiming, compelled by greed for gain and fear of harm, and stirred by anger, the small man or anyone, he will destroy things, will kill members of his own species, and will do everything. In extreme cases, he will even slaughter his own brothers, and the humanity that forms one body will disappear completely. Hence, this is the critical line. Hence, if it is not obscured by selfish desires, even the mind of the small man has the humanity that forms one body with awe, as does the mind of the great man. As soon as it is obscured by selfish desires, even the mind of the great man will be divided and narrow like that of the small man. So then the danger or the evil comes just because we do our ordinary things, not alertly, not sensitive enough to overcome the kind of problems, which means habit, the bad habit. In health terms, we do not take care of our body that well for eating or exercising. We do not do that on ordinary situation because we feel we're strong. But then the energy of the body is depleted for the wrong reason, wasteful and so forth. Then we become sick. Now, in the ethical terms, we allow the bad habits to overcome us. So this inertia, if it accumulated for a long time, you cannot give it up. That's why addiction is so serious, because accumulated a long time, then when you want to really get rid of it, it becomes very difficult. And yet, don't give up, because if it can be accumulated this way, it can also be decreased. How? This is overall, it's a struggle. The other one, which is equally important, is don't allow your heart and mind to become narrowed, to become insensitized, become limited, especially not because your own self-imposition. Just allow you not to be touched, because there's so many things we have to do. We have to live in a cocoon now. Otherwise, we'll not be able to find our identity, our inner self. If we open ourselves to all these forces, it would be what we call identity diffusion. Sure, that's a security measure, there's a purpose for self-protection. But if that strategy affects the true nature of our heart and mind, that could consider extremely detrimental. Then self-deception is the failure to understand what is our true self. That's opening, flowing, communicating, developing, and simply our private ego. They are interconnected, no question about that. One is the great body, one is the small body. Allow the great body to take lead. Allow the small body to be satisfied in the proper situation, in the proper measure. So self-deception is to say, well, I can indulge myself to do something because I deserve it. I work too hard. I have to do it. That's fine. But that indulgence would not become a habit. That indulgence would not become a trajectory that some higher principles are being totally overcome. So then I think maybe the final point, the question of health is the general wholesomeness of our body. It is not so whether we're sick or not. Don't worry about being sick. Sometimes totally beyond our control because the forces from the outside. But the sickness can be overcome, can be cured. But the overall quality of our life, in terms of the vital energy that should be an integral part of us, if that's depleted, it will be the worst possible situation. In other words, we can almost like our immune system is destroyed, I guess. If the vital energy is depleted, it means that we may not be sick. We're just fine. But once we become sick, it's fatal. If we have the vital energy, we have the strength, we can become sick many times. We always bounce back. Ethically speaking, don't afraid to make mistakes. You should take chance. You have to do things. We make mistakes. But the overall quality of life, our direction, our sense of well-being is not being challenged, it's being undermined because of these mistakes. We correct these mistakes. However, if this overall direction, overall strength is not there, we never make any mistakes. And yet, when a mistake is made, it could become very critical and crucial. So the important thing is to develop an inner sense of direction and interconnectedness with a much larger universe, and to understand one's own well-being, not in a narrow, fragmented, limited sense, but in a much more holistic, dynamic, and transformative sense.